Hey Chaver, what's going on? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud Aleph, Daf 11 of Masechta Ayruvin. Today's Daf talks about Tsuras hapesach. That's essentially the topic for today's Daf. It's cool. I mean, there's a bunch of different opinions that you got to kind of organize in your head, like who says what. But it's not too messy or anything. You just gotta stay clear on who says what. Some of the things that we're going to talk about are basically what is a Tsuras hapesach, how to construct it, can it be wider than 10 amos, can it be less than 10 amos, and then at the end we talk a little bit about Mezuzah, which is interesting. What happens if you have a doorway that's kilu domed, it's got a round top, not just a 90-degree angle top. So, do you have to put up a mezuzah or not? So, we're going to get that towards the end. And then, right after that, we're going to start a new Mishnah, finally. The second Mishnah of Masechta Ayruvin. Okay? Without further ado, let's get started, friends. So, we're going to get started on Daf Yud Amud Beis, very, very close to the bottom, 4 lines from the bottom. So, we said in our Mishnah that a mavui can be as high up as 20 amas, right? You can have that korah over there. And in terms of its width, it can be up to 10 amas wide. If it is more than 10 amas wide, you have to make it narrower. The Mishnah then said, however, if there's a Tsuras hapesach, so then it can be wider than 10 amas. Now, what is this Tsuras hapesach? So, basically, Tsuras hapesach is almost like this superpower. Super interesting. Tsuras hapesach is like a superpower. And we're going to see in the Gemara, on Yud Aleph Amud Beis, there's a brayso, I'll just even quote it now. It says, Tana Tsuras hapesach she'amru kana mikan v'kana mikan v'kana al gabein. In the simplest form, right, what's a Tsuras hapesach? You take a pole and you stick it down in the ground vertically. Take another pole, you stick it down next to it in the ground vertically. A little bit of space in between. You take another pole, you put it on top of those two horizontally. That's your Tsuras hapesach, a doorway. Okay? That is a Tsuras hapesach. And what's super interesting about Tsuras hapesach is that there's no limit to how wide it can be. It's going to be a machlokus between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan / Rish Lakish. But the halacha we paskin that if you make a Tsuras hapesach, it could be any amount wide. And then, not only that, as we're going to see in the Gemara as well, a Tsuras hapesach, you could basically take 2 poles and take some grapevine, or what we generally do, I think, is like some fishing line, and then you can just put it from one pole to the next, and that's your Tsuras hapesach. And because it can be, when you kind of combine all these ingredients, which is that Tsuras hapesach could literally just be some fish line on top of some poles, and there's no limit to how wide it can be. Well, that's how you get our modern day Ayruvin, which is basically take an entire town, entire city, wrap it in fish line, and now you have an Eruv. So Tsuras hapesach is like this, and you don't even know it. You don't even see the fish line, and yet that counts to be considered all like one rishus. So it's got kind of these like superpowers, which is interesting. Okay. Says the Gemara, Yud Amud Beis, all the way at the bottom, 2 lines from the bottom. So we saw in the Mishnah that a Tsuras hapesach works in terms of fixing width, right? Meaning the Mishnah had said that if a mavui is wider than 10 amas, you have to make it narrower. However, if there is a Tsuras hapesach, so then you don't have to make it narrower. That is fine. And also we said that if a mavui is right, if the korah is higher than 20 amas, well then you have to, lower it. So, but if there was an amaltera, which is like some kind of design that's going to catch your eye, so then you don't have to lower it. So we see that Tsuras hapesach is this like special exception when it comes to width, and amaltera is this special exception when it comes to height. Ipchamai. What about flipping it around? Can amaltera work to fix the width? Can a Tsuras hapesach work to fix height? So Tashma coming here, Desanya, that we learn in the Brayso, Mavui Shugavoa me'esrim amma yimoit. So if you have a mavui that is higher than, it's taller than 20 amas, you have to lower it. V'myesh l'tzuras hapesach, eino tzarich l'moit. However, if there's a Tsuras hapesach darin, so then you don't need to lower this mavui. Okay, so apparently Tsuras HaPesach works even when it comes to height. Very fancy stuff. Amaltara b'roch b'mai. Now this amaltara, this fancy design, so it works for height to catch your eye. What about for width? Tashma kaminir desanya, we're learning a brayso. Mavi shugavoa me'eser amas. If you have a mavi that's higher than 20 amas, you have to make it lower. Varoch me'eser. And if you have a mavi that's wider than 10 amas, you also have to make that narrower. Now, if there's a Tsuras HaPesach dartin, so then you don't need to make the mavui narrower. And if there's an amaltara, then you don't need to make it, you don't need to make it smaller. The question is, my lava seifa. So we want to assume that that's talking about the seifa, i.e. it's talking about width. And saying that if there's an amaltara, then that also works for width, that if you have a mavi that's too wide, but there's an amaltara, I guess, on like a lechi, a very fancy lechi, so then you wouldn't have to make the mavui narrower. Lower ratio. No, it's talking about the ratio, that meaning when it's too tall, so you have to make it lower, but if there's an amaltara, you don't have to make it lower. But it's not necessarily a proof that an amaltara works for width, but it would appear that a Tsuras HaPesach works for height in addition to width. Masni la Rav Yehuda l'chia barav kami derav. So Rav Yehuda was teaching to Chia, the son of Rav, in front of Rav. Eino tzarich l'mayit, that if you have a Tsuras HaPesach, well then you don't need to make the mavui any narrower. Okay. Amalei asni tzarich l'mayit. So Rav corrected Rav Yehuda and said, no, teach that you do need to make it narrower. That if you have a mavui that is wider than 10 amas, but there's a Tsuras HaPesach dartin, so our Mishnah said that you don't need to make it narrower. Rav disagrees. Rav says that even if there's a Tsuras HaPesach, the maximum width for a mavui is 10 amas. Okay, so we see that Rav disagrees with this notion and holds that even with the Tsuras HaPesach, the maximum width of a mavui is 10 amas. Rav Yosef. Now says Rav Yosef, Midiv Rabbeinu Nilmad. So let us learn from Rabbeinu. Who's Rabbeinu? Rabbeinu is Rav. So let us learn from Rav that chotzer. Okay, so put away mavi for a second. We're talking about a chatzer, right? You have Rishus HaYachid, you have a chatzer, some kind of courtyard that's surrounded by walls. Let's just say it's surrounded by 4 walls. Now, sheruba psachim v'achloinis. Now, most of the wall, however, that is surrounding this chatzer is entryways and windows. Says, so now look at the diagram over here on 11a1. So you can see that there's this diagram. And what you can see in the diagram is that here's this wall. And it's basically, there's that main entryway in the middle. And there's a bunch of windows. So it's mostly these like windows and entryways. Now, obviously, now as you can see in the middle there's this line that's in the right, that's indicating 10 tefachim. And the point is that, so this entryway is obviously a complete gap, complete space. That's not going to be considered wall by the entryway, but also by the windows, right? What the diagram is showing is that the space underneath the windows, the wall underneath the windows is less than 10 tefachim tall, which means that those aren't considered walled area either, right? There is no 10 tefachim of wall before the window begins. So basically you can't count any of the area as wall, that obviously by the area of the entranceway, because there's no wall there whatsoever, but even by the windows, where there's some wall underneath the windows, but that's less than 10 tefachim, which means that you cannot count that as wall either. So when you combine all of the area of windows and doorways, you basically have more space than you have wall, i.e. parts meruba ala omed, which when it comes to chatzeris, when it comes to walls, one of the criteria is that you need to have more wall than space. But over here it appears that you'd have more space than wall. So therefore that would not be a good chatzer. However, there's a question. Each of these areas, right, the Pesach, the entranceway, also the windows, they have a Tsuras HaPesach, right? The entranceway, certainly, there's 10 tefachim of height, and then you have, right, on either side, then you have like the ceiling ki'ilu, like the top, the cross beam. So that's the Tzuras HaPesach by the entryway. And even by these windows, so while there isn't 10 tefachim of wall before the window begins, but if you view this as a Tzuras HaPesach, if you view this as a Tzuras HaPesach, well, look at the sides of the windows, right? So if you take the sides of the windows and go straight down to the ground, so you can kind of view that as though you have walls of 10 tefachim before it starts arching to reach the top of the window. So you have 10 tefachim of wall, and then if you kind of keep on going up until the top of the window, well, then there is basically a crossbeam, i.e. it's in an arch, but you can since you already have 10 tefachim of wall, you can kind of ignore sort of the arch, like the side arches, and just ki'ilu, imagine that it's going straight up to the top of the wall, where you're gonna basically, there's a crossbeam over there. So both the entranceways and the windows can theoretically be considered to be Tzuras HaPesach. So while on the one hand, the majority of this wall is parutz, it's parutz meruba ala omed, while most of this wall is airspace and not wall. However, all the air spaces do have a Tzuras HaPesach. So the question is, do we view it as parutz meruba ala omed, which is a problem? Or do we say, but all of these parutzes, all of these spaces, every single one is a Tzuras HaPesach. So maybe the Tzuras HaPesach is able to fix the parutz meruba ala omed, just like Tzuras HaPesach is able to fix when the mavui is more than 10 amis wide, at least according to our Mishnah. So now, what Rav Yosef is trying to argue is that, well, since Rav holds that Tzuras HaPesach doesn't work when the mavui is wider than 10 amis, so Rav Yosef wants to argue that he would say the same thing when it comes to parutz meruba ala omed. When it comes to this case of the wall that has lots of entrances and windows, but all of them have a Tzuras HaPesach, but there's parutz meruba ala omed, does the Tzuras HaPesach in this case work to fix all of these gaps? That is what we're talking about. So again, Amar Rav Yosef, says Rav Yosef, Midivrei Rabbeinu nilmad, let's learn from Rav, that chatzor sheruba psachim v'achloinis, if you have a chatzor, that most of the wall is just entryways and windows, so i.e. it's parutz meruba ala omed, einan niteres b'tzuras HaPesach. So even though all of these space areas have a Tzuras HaPesach, it's irrelevant. These Tzuras HaPesachs are not going to fix the fact that it's parutz meruba ala omed. My time, how come Rav Yosef is making this assertion? Well, since when you have, since when it comes to a mavui, when a mavui is wider than 10 amis, that is a problem. And when you have a chatzer, and the walls of the chatzer are parutz meruba ala omed, there's more space than there is wall, that's a problem. So well, just like when it comes to a mavui, according to Rav, putting up a Tzuras HaPesach when it's wider than 10 amis doesn't make any difference. Well, then also, well, I'll argue then that according to Rav, when you have parutz meruba ala omed, which is a problem when it comes to a chatzar, also Tzuras HaPesach makes zero difference. So the Gemara wants to say, maybe that is inconclusive. Maybe you cannot just assume that just because by a mavui, Rav holds that Tzuras HaPesach will be ineffective when it's wider than 10 amis, you can't necessarily say that the same would apply to parutz meruba ala omed by a chatzar, because I can argue that the width of a mavui is stricter than parutz meruba ala omed, and therefore even if by a mavui that's wider than 10 amis, Rav will not permit the use of a Tzuras HaPesach to permit it. However, Rav may still hold that you can use Tzuras HaPesach by parutz meruba ala omed. How come? That when it comes to the width that is greater than 10 amis of a mavui, shekein lo hitarta bo etzel pasei beiros l'Rab Meir. That when it comes to pasei beiros, which has come up before, right, pasei beiros were these corners that you can put around a well in Rishus Harabim, that they had these wells for the people that would be ole regel, so that they can have water for themselves and for their animals. So there was a chiddush over there, which is that parts muba ala omed goes out the window. You're allowed to have more space than wall, as long as you have an amma of wall in each direction for each corner, right? So in each corner you have, right, so let's just say north, south, east, west. So let's just say on the northern part of the well, so you have kilu one amma in one corner of wall, one amma in the other corner of wall. Even though the entire area is space, that's fine. You have the same thing on each of the directions. Kilu at either end there's one amma of wall, and then the rest of it is space. So in that case, so parts mubala omed is no problem over there. Yet we do say that, at least according to Rabbi Meir, the spaces between the corners has to be 10 amas or less. So we see that the 10 amas maximum is stricter than paras mubala omed, because nobody, right, when it comes to pasei beiros, everyone agrees that paras mubala omed is acceptable. That's like the whole chiddush of pasei beiros. Yet, even though Rabbi Yehuda says that you're allowed to have more than 10 amas of space, right? We said the other day you can have 13 and a third amas of space according to Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Meir nonetheless argues and says that you wouldn't be able to have more than 10 amas of space. So we see that while everyone agrees that you can have paras mubala omed, it's not as clear when it comes to a width of 10 amas, which means that the width of 10 amas is already a more contested sugya, and it's more chamor than paras mubala omed, right? So again, so maliosa me'eser oser b'mavui, when you have the more than 10 amas of width by a mavui, sheken lo itarta bo etzel pasei beiros l'Rab Meir, that when it comes to a width of more than 10, Rab Meir is going to argue by pasei beiros that would not be acceptable. Tomar b'paras muba ala omed. So, right, are you now going to apply the halachas of more than 10 to the halachas of paras muba ala omed oser b'chotzer sheken itarta etzel pasei beiros l'divrei hakol? That everyone agrees that when it comes to pasei beiros, you're allowed to have paras mubala omed, and therefore I might argue that even though Rav says that by paras mubala, that by a width greater than 10 by a mavui, you cannot fix that with the Tsuras hapesach. However, maybe Rav would argue that when it comes to paras mubala omed, you can fix it with the Tsuras hapesach because it's not as strict as the width being greater than 10. Okay. Now the Gemara says, let's say that the following brisa actually supports Rav Yosef's argument to say that just like Rav says that a Tsuras hapesach is ineffective at a width greater than 10 amas, he would also say that Tsuras hapesach is ineffective by paras mubala omed. As we learn in a brisa, that when you have these walls, that the majority of the wall consists of openings and of windows. Mutter, you are allowed to carry inside of this chatzar. But so long as it's omed meruba ala paretz, so long as there's more wall than there is space. So the Gemara says, Sheruban salkadaitech? How could that make any sense? How could you possibly have, on the one hand, a chatzar that consists of walls that are mostly doorways and windows, i.e. mostly space, and yet you're going to have omed ruba ala paretz, more wall than space? Those are mutually exclusive. If it's majority windows and doorways, then it's certainly not a majority of standing wall. Okay, no, so rather don't say that the majority is entranceways and windows. Rather say that there are lots of entranceways and windows. So there's a whole bunch of entranceways and windows. Yet, as long as it's omed muba ala parutz, so then you'd be able to carry in there. So what do we see? So we see that we're saying that when it comes to this chatzer, it must be, and this is the same chatzir that we're talking about, right? You have psachim, you have chalonis, all of them have tzuras hapesach, and it's pretty clear that you can only carry in there if it's omed muba ala parutz. But if it's parutz muba ala omed, well then tzuras hapesach are irrelevant. So that seems to support Rav Yosef's explanation of Rav. So Amar of Kahana, Kitanya ayi bepischei shimai. So the Gemara says, no, you cannot bring a proof from there, from that brisa, because that brisa is pischei shimai. My pischei shimai. What are pischei shimai? Pligi ba Rav Rechume v'Rav Yosef. Rav Rechume and Rav Yosef argue chad amar deleislu shakve v'chad amar deleislu tikra. One of them says that it doesn't have walls. The other one says it doesn't have a roof. So basically, what it means that it doesn't have walls, it means that all of these entranceways and windows for this chatzar that we're talking about, that has a whole bunch of psachim and chalonos, that is, they aren't proper tzuras hapesach. How come? One reason is because the sides aren't straight. They aren't vertical. They're like kind of jagged, right? Imagine you had like a full wall and then you kind of, pushed out of it windows and doorways. So the sides aren't straight. And in order to have a proper tzuras hapesach, you have to have completely vertical walls. So because the walls aren't straight, so it's not a proper tzuras hapesach. Or maybe the windows and the doorways didn't actually have a top crossbeam. They were just straight open to the sky. So certainly there it's not a tzuras hapesach either. So Rav Kahana wants to argue that the reason why the brisa says that you would have to have omed muba ala parutz is because all of these breaches, all of these openings and windows, they weren't proper tzuras hapesach. But if they were to have been proper tzuras hapesach, I will argue that you would be able to carry inside, because tzuras hapesach would be effective to fix parts muba ala omed. Okay, so we've seen that according to Rav, a tzuras hapesach cannot be wider than 10 amas. Now, does anybody hold like Rav? So the Gemara says, "V'af Rabbi Yochanan savela lehad Rav." So the Gemara says that even Rabbi Yochanan holds right there. Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rav. Rabbi Yochanan holds that a tzuras hapesach cannot be wider than 10 amas. There was a story of a certain fellow from Bikas Beis Chorson, that he took 4 poles and he stuck them into the ground on the 4 corners of his field, and he took some grapevine and he extended the grapevine from one pole to the other. And the story came before the Chachamim, and they said, okay, it's fine at least regarding kilayim. What does that mean? As we know by now, kilayim is that, at least kilei akarim, is that you cannot plant plant grapevines in the same area that you plant, vegetables or grains. So don't plant your wheat right next to your grapes. However, if there's a wall between where you are planting your wheat and where you're planting your grapes, then it's no problem. The question is, what kind of wall do you need? Do you need like a brick wall? What if you just take 4 poles, stick them up on the sides of your field, and tie some grapevine between the poles? Does that work? Is that considered a wall? Can you now plant wheat on the other side of that line? So, apparently yes. Apparently, just having some poles with some grapevine or some fish line or whatever it is between them would be enough to allow you to plant on the other side. Okay, fine. To plant wheat on the other side, even though you have grapes in that area. Fine. V'amar Rish Lakish, and Rish Lakish says, "K'derech shetiru lo le'inyan kilayim, kach yitiru lo le'inyan Shabbos." And Rish Lakish says that just like it's considered a good partition regarding kilayim, well, it's also a good partition regarding Shabbos, and you'd be allowed to carry in this area demarcated by these poles and grapevine. Rabbi Yochanan Amar le'kilayim yitiru lo, le'inyan Shabbos lo yitiru lo. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan says, no, this is a good tzuras hapesach, this is a good partition regarding kilayim, but you would not be allowed to carry in this area on Shabbos. Now the question is, what exactly is this Tsuras HaPesach? How did he make this poles with the fish line, with the grapevines, and what was the context in which he made it? That Rish Lakish is saying that you're allowed to carry in it on Shabbos, and Rabbi Yochanan saying that you're not. So Ma'askin, what are we talking about? Ilema min atzad. Okay, so if we're talking about where you tie the grapevine from the side, and as Rashi explains, kilu, in the middle of the poles. Now he took some grapevine and he basically wrapped them around the middles of the poles. And we're trying to figure out, can you carry in there on Shabbos? Rav Chisda says, when it comes to Tsuras HaPesach, if you apply this grapevine from the side, it's completely irrelevant. So therefore, if that's the case, then how could Rish Lakish say that you're allowed to carry inside of this area demarcated by the poles and the grapevines? Right? Rav Chisda is pretty adamant about the fact that when you have the grapevine around the middle of the poles, it's completely pointless. So why would Rish Lakish say that you're allowed to carry in that area? So Ella Agabon. So it must be that the grapevine was on top of the poles. So took the grapevine, put it from pole to pole on the top of it. Mamish, like on top of the pole. Imagine you take, imagine you take two reeds and you stick them in two poles, you put them on the ground, you take another pole, stick them on top of that, meaning kilu, on top of the pole, not necessarily towards the top, but mamish, like resting on top of the pole. Okay, so if that's what we're talking about, right? So Ella al Gabon, so we're talking about where the grapevine was mamish on top of each of the poles. Uvimai, and what else? Ilema be'eser, if we're saying that these poles were within 10 amas of each other, then why in the world would Rabbi Yochanan say that you're not allowed to carry in this area? Everyone agrees that Tsuras HaPesach is a thing. Everyone agrees that there is validity to Tsuras HaPesach, and that if you constructed a Tsuras HaPesach that was 10 amas or less, everyone would agree that that's a good Tsuras HaPesach. It only becomes fuzzier, it becomes fuzzier when the Tsuras HaPesach is wider than 10 amas. We saw that Rav says that a Tsuras HaPesach can't be wider than 10 amas. And let's say that this is exactly the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. That this fellow, in Bigaz Beis Chorson, he took poles and he took grapevine and he put it from pole to pole on top of it. The only thing is that it was wider than 10 amas between each pole. Rish Lakish says that that's fine. And Rabbi Yochanan says it's not fine. And that's why he says that you're not allowed to carry there on Shabbos, because the Tsuras HaPesach was wider than 10 amas. The Gemara says, lo, not true. Lo olam be'eser. Really, it is talking about where these poles were 10 amas or less from each other. Well, if that's the case, then why is Rabbi Yochanan saying that you're not allowed to carry over there? Umin atzad, but it's talking about where the grapevines were in the middle of the poles, not at the top. And the assertion of Rav Chisda that when you have the grapevines in the middle of the poles, that when you have Tzuras HaPesach that's min atzad, it's completely irrelevant. That's exactly the machlokas between Rish Lakish. That's exactly what Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan are arguing about. Rabbi Yochanan, is on the same way, perspective as Rav Chisda, which is, that if you do it from the side, it's completely pointless. And that's why you're not allowed to carry in there on Shabbos. But Rish Lakish says it's not completely pointless. Rish Lakish says that you would be allowed to carry in there on Shabbos if it's from the side. Now, keep in mind that we're talking about where we said that it's 10 amas or less. Right? So we're saying that he took this grapevine, he wrapped it around these poles, they were 10 amas or less from each other. And Rish Lakish is saying that you'd be allowed to carry in that area. Rabbi Yochanan is saying forget about it. But the important point for us being that if the grapevine was above the poles, well then everyone would agree that it would work even if the poles are more than 10 amas away from each other. So the Gemara wants to say that Rabbi Yochanan does not agree with Rav. that Rav says that a Tsuras HaPesach cannot be wider than 10 amas. Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish both agree that a Tsuras HaPesach, assuming that it's built properly, assuming that it's built with the top cross beam above the side vertical beams, so then it can be even wider than 10 amas. Virami de Rabbi Yochanan ad Rabbi Yochanan, Virami de Rish Lakish ad Rish Lakish. So now the Gemara says you can actually argue or ask the question that both Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan seem to actually be contradicting themselves in another context. What's that? Dam Rish Lakish mishum Rabbi Yehuda b'Rab Chanina. That Rish Lakish said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda b'Rab Chanina, Peya muteres l'inyan kilayim v'alo l'Shabbos. That Peya, basically when you create this Tsuras HaPesach, when you take the 4 poles and you put them in the side of on the corners of your field, then you take some grapevine and you connect the poles. So Rish Lakish is saying in the name of Rabbi Yehuda b'Rab Chanina that muteres l'inyan kilayim, that is effective for kilayim, to allow you to plant different crops on either side of this area. Avalo l'Shabbos, but you'd be unable to carry in this area on Shabbos. So now this is different than what Rish Lakish said a minute ago, which is that you can carry in this area on Shabbos. Now he's saying that you cannot. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, and said Rabbi Yochanan, Ki mechitzis l'Shabbos dilo, kach mechitzis l'kilayim dilo. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying that actually, just like you're not allowed to carry in this area on Shabbos, it also wouldn't be considered a proper demarcation for kilayim either. Now, a minute ago, Rabbi Yochanan said that it works for kilayim, it just doesn't work for Shabbos. Now he's saying it works for neither one. So what's pshat? Rish Lakish said a minute ago that this Tsuras HaPesach works both for kilayim and for Shabbos. Now he's saying it works for kilayim but not for Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan had said that it works for kilayim but not for Shabbos. Now he's saying it doesn't work for anything. What's going on? Okay, so Bishlam adu Rish Lakish adu Rish Lakish lo kasha. So it's easy to answer for Rish Lakish because hadidei hadarabe, right? The first case he's not quoting anybody; he's just saying his own opinion. In this case, he's quoting Rabbi Yehuda b'Rab Chanina. So you can say that the difference in opinion between Rish Lakish is that in the first case he was expressing his opinion. In the second case, he was expressing his teacher's opinion, and that's why they're different. But what do you do with Rabbi Yochanan? What do you do with the fact that Rabbi Yochanan seems to be contradicting himself? Well, then the Gemara gives one possible solution, which is, well, a good possible solution is to say that in the case where Rabbi Yochanan says that it works for kilayim is when the grapevines were on top of the poles. And we're saying that it doesn't work for kilayim, it's where the grapevines were on the side of the poles. So when the grapevines are on the side of the poles, it doesn't work for kilayim. Does not. When the grapevines are on top of the poles, it works for kilayim. But what's he also saying? That it doesn't work for Shabbos. Now, obviously, we're not talking about when it's less than 10 amos away from each other, because then, of course, it would work for Shabbos. So, Elamai must be talking about the first case is talking about where this fellow from Bigaz Beis Chorsan, he put these poles in the corners of his field. He put the grapevine on top of the corners, on top of these poles, more than 10 amos away from each other. And we're saying, Rabbi Yochanan is saying that it works for kilayim, but not for Shabbos. So it would sound like he actually agrees with Rav that a Tsuras HaPesach is ineffective when there's a distance, when it's wider than 10 amos. But, says the Gemara, if you want to argue like we argued a few minutes ago, which was to say that the fellow in Bigaz Beis Chorsan had the grapevine around the sides, which is why Rabbi Yochanan says that you're not allowed to use it on Shabbos. But if it was on the top, you would be able to use it on Shabbos. Well, then what's this case where Rabbi Yochanan is saying that the grapevine Tsuras HaPesach is ineffective even for kilayim? What's the problem? So the Gemara says, Le'olam, idi v'idi min hatzad. So the Gemara says, no, you can actually say that they're both talking about, right, both cases, by this fellow from Bikas Beis Chorsan, as well as this case over here. They're both talking about from the side. And there's a reason why Rabbi Yochanan says that in one case it works for Kilayim and in the other case it doesn't. But Hasan be'eser, Acham be'oser me'eser. As the Gemara had said, that when it comes to the fellow from Bikas Beis Chorsan, yeah, it was from the side, right? The grapevine was wrapped around the middle of the poles. But the poles were less than 10 amas away from each other, and that's why it works for Kilayim. Over here, when Rabbi Yochanan is saying that it doesn't work for anything, including Kilayim, that's because the poles were more than 10 amas away from each other. However, if the vines would have been on top of the poles, then they could be any distance away from each other, according to Rabbi Yochanan. Even on Shabbos. And how do I know that there's a difference when it comes to Kilayim and having the grapevines around the sides? How do I know that there's a difference between if the poles are 10 amas away from each other or not? Because Rabbi Yochanan said to Rish Lakish, Lo kachaya amaise, was this not the story Shalach Rabbi Yehoshua, it's Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Lomad Torah? That Rabbi Yehoshua went to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri to learn Torah. Now, there was a note in the art school that said that this isn't the regular Rabbi Yehoshua, because Rabbi Yehoshua would not have been a student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, rather this is Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha. Okay. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha, we'll just call him Rabbi Yehoshua because that's what the Gemara says, but at least according to that note, apparently it's Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha. Seder. So Rabbi Yehoshua went to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri Lomad Torah, to go study Torah. Now, Afal Pisha Baki Bilchus Kilayim. Now, even though Rabbi Yehoshua was a Baki, an expert when it came to the halachis of Kilayim, he nonetheless went to learn by Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And he saw that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was sitting among the trees. And he had a grapevine from tree to tree. He had set up a Tsuras hapesach with grapevine. And Rabbi Yehoshua asked him, he said, hey, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, if I plant grapes in this area, would I be able to plant other things, like let's say wheat, outside of this vined area? Amrlo be'eser mutter biyoser me'eser aser. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri responded that if the trees are 10 amas or less away from each other, so then you would be then it would work, and you would be allowed to plant grapes in this area and let's say wheat outside. But if the trees were more than 10 amas away from each other, then it would not work for Kilayim. You would not be able to plant grapes on the inside and wheat on the outside. Now, b'maya skina, and what are we talking about? Ilema al gaban. Now, if we're talking about where the grapevines were on top of these trees, well, yosem eser aser, would you not be, would it be forbidden to plant, would it be forbidden for Kilayim when the trees are more than 10 amas away from each other? We learn in the Brisa, that if you basically took these poles that were sharp at the bottom, you stuck them into the ground, and then you put grapevines on top of them. So when it comes to Kilayim, the Mishnah says, or Brisa, that everyone agrees that it can be even more than 10 amas away from each other, as long as the grapevine is on top. Rather, it must be that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was talking about where the grapevines are wrapped around the trees from the side. And he's saying that it's mutter to plant within this demarcated area grapes and then let's say wheat outside, as long as the area between the trees is less than 10 amas. More than that is a problem. So we see that when it comes to minatzad, there is a difference between smaller than 10 amas and larger than 10 amas. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan said later on that this Tsuras hapesach doesn't even work for, or not necessarily Tsuras hapesach, but this, these poles with the grapevine around it doesn't work when it doesn't work for Kilayim. That's because it was more than 10 amas. When he said on the previous page, on Amud Aleph, that it works for Kalayim, that's because it was less than 10 amos. It doesn't work when it's more than 10 amos, it works when it's less than 10 amos. However, if the grapevine were to be on top of the trees, well then, it would work even if it's larger than 10 amos, and even the Indian Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Gufa, we said earlier, Amar of Chizda Tsuras HaPesach she'asa min atzad lo asav lo klum. Said of Chizda that if you have a Tsuras HaPesach that you make from the side, it's completely pointless. Okay? Amar of Chizda Tsuras HaPesach she'amu tzricha shtei bria k'dei lahamid ba deles v'afilu deles shel kashin. Interesting. It says of Chizda that when we talk about a Tsuras HaPesach, it has to be at least strong enough to hold a door. Now, this door doesn't have to be a heavy door. It can even just be a very basic, very lightweight door made out of straw. That's fine, but it has to be, something. It has to be, a minimal amount of strength that can hold, at least just like a door made out of straw. Amr Rish Lakish, Mishum Reb Yanai, says Rish Lakish, the name of Reb Yanai, Tzuras HaPesach tzricha heker tzir. That a Tzuras HaPesach, in a Tzuras HaPesach, there has to be like, a place for a pivot. Ma'eker tzir, Amr of Avya Avkisa. Says of Avya, it's an Avkisa. Meaning, basically, I guess at one point in time, it was like a hinge, but not like our hinges. Basically, you'd have the door, and the door would have let's just say like a peg on the top and on the bottom, and would go into some like hole area, and that would kind of keep the door in place and allow it to rotate. So, a Tzuras HaPesach needs to have that. I don't think that we pass in that way. Hashkachinu Rav Acha Bre de Rav Avya the Talmidei de Rav Ashi. Now, Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avya, who just said that Tzuras HaPesach needs to have this like hinge, so he found the students of Rav Ashi, Amrlu, and he said to them, Amr Ma'amidi b'Tzuras HaPesach. Did Rav Ashi say anything about Tzuras HaPesach? I.e., he was hoping to find out if Rav Ashi said anything about his father's opinion, i.e., that Tzuras HaPesach requires a hinge. Amr Le'lo Amr V'lo Klum, they said he didn't say anything, at least regarding the hinge. Okay. Tana, we learn in the Brayso, Tzuras HaPesach, Sh'amu kanu mikan v'kanu mikan v'kanu al gaben. What's a Tzuras HaPesach? A Tzuras HaPesach is you stick one pole over here, and then, a little bit away, you stick another pole, parallel, and then you stick a third pole on top of them, perpendicular, and you have a beautiful, beautiful Tzuras HaPesach. Frag the Gemara, an interesting kasha. Tzrichin liga or ain't tzrichin liga? Does the pole that you stick vertically, does it mamish have to reach the perpendicular pole that is laid across it horizontally? Does it mamish have to touch the pole? Does it have to go all the way up and touch the cross pole? And I feel like you see this a lot of times, meaning you'll see let's say some kind of like fish line or something like that. Now, the pole doesn't necessarily go all the way up to the fish line. You can see it maybe nailed into let's say, some kind of other pole. So this, vertical pole doesn't go all the way up to the top. It probably just has to be 10 tefachim. Then it doesn't say anything about good asik, so I won't say it either. But the point is that it doesn't necessarily have to be touching the question is, does it have to be touching that cross pole or not? So, Rav Nachman Amar Ein Tzrichin Liga. Rav Sheshes Amar Tzrichin Liga. So Rav Nachman says that the vertical pole doesn't actually have to go all the way up so that it's touching the cross pole. Rav Sheshes says that it does need to be touching. Also Rav Nachman, Vavad Uvda Bereish Gelusa Kishmaite. So Rav Nachman went to the Reish Gelusa and he set up an Eruv for them. He set up a Tzuras HaPesach for them. And when he set up the Tzuras HaPesach, it was the vertical beams, the vertical poles were not touching the horizontal poles. Amalei Rav Sheshes L'Shamai Rav Gada. So Rav Sheshes said to his attendant Rav Gada, Zil Shlof Shadinu. Go destroy this. Go take out these vertical poles. Basically, destroy the Tzuras HaPesach. Also, Shalav Shadinu. So, Rav Gada went and he destroyed the Tzuras HaPesach of the Reish Gelusa, which is a very risky thing to do. Ashkachu Devei Reish Gelusa Chavshu. So the Reish Gelusa found Rav Gada and they put him in jail for, vandalizing the property of the Reish Gelusa. Also, Rav Sheshes Kama Bava. So interestingly then, Rav Sheshes went to the gate of the prison. Amalei Gada Pokta. He says, Gada, get out of here. Come over here. Nafak Vasa. So, Rav Gada walked out of the prison and went to Rav Sheshes and they walked away. And that was that. Okay. L'chatchila riber. Ashkechei Rav Sheshes l'Rabba bar Shmuel. Now, Rav Sheshes found Rabba bar Shmuel. Amarle Tani Mar Midi b'Tsuras hapesach. And Rav Sheshes said to Rabba bar Shmuel, did you teach anything about Tsuras hapesach? Amarle in, he said, yeah, I did teach something about Tsuras hapesach. Tanina, we learn in a, Mishnah. Kippah. When it comes to a kippah, what's a kippah? A kippah is basically if you have a doorway, but the posts are not straight, right? They don't go all the way up to the top. Rather, towards the top, they begin to arch. So it's an arched doorway. So you don't have a 90-degree Tsuras hapesach. So Meir Mechayv b'Mezuzah v'Chacham Potrin. So Meir says that it's Chayv b'Mezuzah. Chacham say it's Potter from a Mezuzah. V'Shavin, now everyone agrees, Shem Yesh b'Raglea Asara She'i Chayeves. Now everyone agrees that if the posts, if the sides of the door have 10 tfachim before it begins to arch, well then you're going to have to put up a mezuzah, right? If the doorway is 10 tfachim tall and also 4 tfachim wide, as we're going to see, right? Basically a doorway to be chayiv mezuzah, the doorway has to be at least 4 tfachim wide and it has to be 10 tfachim tall. So everyone agrees that if the doorway is 10 tfachim tall, and only above that does it begin to arch, well then you're going to have to put up a mezuzah. Amar Abai says, Abai, komodim im gavoa asara v'im b'raglea shlosha. Now says Abai, if this doorway is a total of 10 tfachim tall, meaning at the peak of the archway, it's only 10 tfachim tall, v'im b'raglea shlosha, and it already starts curving in and becoming less than 4 tfachim within 3 tfachim of the ground, meaning it doesn't even have 3 tfachim of height where it's 4 tfachim wide. Inami, yesh b'raglea shlosha, or else it does have 3 tfachim of height where it's 4 tfachim wide, but ve'en gavo asara, but the total height of the doorway is less than 10 tfachim. V'lo klum, then you're not going to need a mezuzah, right? In order to have a mezuzah, you have to have 10 tfachim of height and 4 tfachim of width. If it begins to curve in, to arch in, less than 3 tfachim from the ground, well, we know that 3 tfachim height is enough to be, that's like kind of the minimum to be considered a height. I don't want to get into lavud and stuff like that because that's where it gets complicated. Rashi specifically is avoiding using lavud, but there have been other places where we describe. I don't want to use lavud. I just want to say that everyone does agree that if it doesn't have 4 tfachim of width for a height of 3 tfachim, then there's nothing to talk about. And also, if it doesn't have a total of 10 tfachim height, the entire doorway, there's also nothing to talk about. Ki plige, where they argue, is b'yesh b'raglea gimel. It's when the height has 3 tfachim, right? There's 3 tfachim of height where the doorway has a width of 4 tfachim. V'gavo asar, and the total height of the doorway is 10 tfachim. Ve'ein richava arba. However, the archway obviously begins before 10 tfachim of height, meaning the total height of the doorway is 10 tfachim. And there's also 4 tfachim of width at the bottom, and that width continues for a height of 3 tfachim, but once it hits 3 tfachim, it then begins arching in, then the archway begins, and there's a total height of 10 tfachim. So the question is, can you kind of imaginarily, that the word that I made up the other day, can you imaginarily assume, can you just like, ki'ilu, you take a knife and kind of etch out a straight line to the top of the 10 tefach doorway and, imaginarily consider it ki'ilu, the wall, there are 10 tefachim of vertical height of 4 tefachim width. Right? You could theoretically take a knife and, etch away at the doorway, and then you would have a complete width of 4 tefachim for a height of 10 tefachim. Rav Meir So Rav Meir says, yeah, you can do that, and that's why he requires a mezuzah, because it's ki'ilu, you have a doorway of 4 tefachim width and 10 tefachim height. Chachamim say that you do not do that, and therefore you only have 3 tefachim of height by a 4 tefachim width, and therefore it's not chayiv in a mezuzah. So what do we see? Well, we said, forget about the complicated parts like where they argue and stuff, but we said that everyone agrees that if the door posts are 10 tefachim in height with 4 tefachim in width, and the arch only begins after that point, they're going to have to put up a mezuzah. Now, what about the fact that the walls are not reaching, right? The vertical walls start arching in before they reach the horizontal crossbeam. So you don't exactly have these walls touching the crossbeam. And yet we're saying that you still put up a mezuzah. And therefore the assumption is that that would also be a good Tsuras hapesach. So it seems that the walls don't actually have to reach the crossbeam, which is a kasha on Rav Shesh's opinion. Rav Shesh's opinion that he's so adamantly enforced by vandalizing the property of the Reish Galusa. And then he's asking Rabbi Bar Shmuel if he knows any halachas regarding Tsuras hapesach, and he dafka told him basically that the walls don't have to reach the crossbeam. So says Rav Sheshes Amarle. So Rav Sheshes says to Rabbi Bar Shmuel, if you, by the way, if you see anybody from the Reish Galusa, maybe lo temer lehu Reish Galusa v'lo midi mi'amasnisa dechifa. Maybe if you see people at the Reish Galusa, don't tell them this brisa. You know, it'll probably keep me out of trouble. Fine. New Mishnah, very very smooth. Rav Sheshes. New Mishnah. Very nice. We've been looking forward to this Mishnah for quite a while. After all, we've been talking about lechis and koras for quite a while. It says the Mishnah that in order to, if you have a mavui, you want to be able to carry the mavui, you have to put in, according to Beis Shammai, a lechi and a korah. According to Beis Hillel, either a lechi or a korah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer lechin. Rabbi Eliezer says you have to put 2 lechis. Okay, the Gemara tomorrow is going to figure out if that's 2 lechis plus a korah, or maybe just 2 lechis total. In the name of Rabbi Yishmael, a certain student said before Rabbi Akiva, that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree that if the mavui is less than 4 amas wide, that all you need is either a lechi or a korah. Where's the machlokes? Al rochav me'arba amas vad eser. When the mavui is 10 amas, between 4 and 10 amas wide. That Beis Shammai says you need both a lechi and a korah. Beis Hillel says you need either one. Whereas Rabbi Akiva disagrees with this Talmud who quoted Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. Right? Rabbi Yishmael said that everyone agrees that if it's less than 4 amma width, then you need either a lechi or a korah. Rabbi Akiva says no, the machlokas applies to both. The machlokas applies from, I guess, probably 4 tefachim, which I don't remember if we've no, we haven't seen it yet, but by 4 tefachim is the minimum width that requires anything by a mavui, right? Less than 4 tefachim is just a makom patur. Right? From 4 tefachim width until 10 amma width, there's a machlok between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about do you need both a lechi and a korah, or is it a lechi or a korah? Kiman, now the Gemara wants to assume right now that the Mishnah is talking about a mavui amefulash, a mavui that's open on both ends. So delo kechanani v'lo ketanakama, and what's the Mishnah saying? That there's machlokas, do you need a lechi and a korah, maybe just a lechi or a korah? But friends, remember the machlokas between the Tanakama and Chananya when it came to a mavui amefulash? Tanakama said that on one end you need a Tsuras hapesach, the other end you need, Tanakama said on the other end you need a lechi or a korah. And then Chananya said there's machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. According to Beis Shammai, you need a door on both ends. According to Beis Hillel, you need a door on one end, and on the other end, a lechi or a korah. But nobody says that you could just use a lechi or a korah, or even a lechi and a korah. So this Mishnah seems to be at odds with what we know about mavui amefulash. So Rav Yehuda hachi kamer. Rav Yehuda says no. This is what the Mishnah means. Hechsher mavui sasum ketzad. No, if you have a mavui sasum, then how can you carry in it? Beis Shammai om lechi v'korah. Beis Hillel om o lechi o korah. Beis Shammai says you need a lechi and a korah. Beis Hillel says you need a lechi or a korah. Beis Shammai om lechi v'korah. So Beis Shammai says you need a lechi and a korah. So does that imply that Beis Shammai is saying that in order to carry in this mavui, you need a lechi and a korah because you have to make it like another wall that you wouldn't be able to carry with just the 3 walls of the mavui sasum. You need to mamash have a lechi and a korah to build another wall so that you can carry in the mavui because you need 4 mechitzas midoraisa. Lo, not true. The zrok mishalo shudu mechayiv. No, if you're talking about midoraisa, 3 walls is enough. I mean, at least I can make the argument that according to Beis Shammai, 3 walls is enough. And if you throw something from Rishus Harabim into this mavui, you're already going to be chayiv. However, the Chacham didn't want you to carry in this mavui. So therefore they said, L'tal tal dika arba. Therefore they said, don't carry in the mavui unless there are 4 walls, and that's why you have to build a lechi and a korah. Fine. So it's inconclusive. You can't prove from there that according to Beis Shammai, you need 4 walls. Beis Hillel omer, says Beis Hillel, o lechi o korah. Beis Hillel says that you only need a lechi or a korah. So you don't need a 4th wall. So lema kasavi Beis Hillel shalosh mechitzas deoraisa. So can we make the argument that Beis Hillel holds that 3 mechitzas though are midoraisa? They need to have at least 3 walls. Lo lizok mishtayim ud mechayiv tal tal dika shalosh. I can make the argument that Beis Hillel would say that actually you'll be chayiv for zorek even if there are only 2 walls. It's already a rishus midoraisa. But Chacham said don't carry unless there's a 3rd wall. Okay, Beseder, but it's inconclusive either way. It's just theoretical arguments. Fine. That was Daf Yud Aleph. Yeah, that was manageable as long as you held cup, I think. So basically, the main overwhelming theme of this daf was Tsuras hapesach. Okay, and as long as let's talk about the classic case of Tsuras hapesach is 2 poles that are vertically next to each other, parallel, another pole on top. Okay. Now, in this case, when it comes to kilayim, everyone agrees that even if it's greater than 10 amas, you'd be allowed to plant kilayim. Fine, great. What about when it comes to Shabbos? When it comes to Shabbos, so Rav says if it's greater than 10 amas, then it's not going to work. You can't carry in there. But Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish both say that no, as long as the Tsuras hapesach is on top of the posts, well then you can carry even if it's larger than 10 amas. Okay? And if it's less than 10 amas, then obviously everyone would agree that you can carry in there because that's just a good kosher Tsuras hapesach. Now, what if the top thing isn't on top of it but kind of wrapped around the sides or from side to side? So we say that if it's less than 10 amas, so in terms of kilayim, everyone agrees that it'll work. In terms of Shabbos, so Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't work, and Rish Lakish says that it does work. If it's greater than 10 amas, well then, when it comes to kilayim, so Rish Lakish says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Reb Chanina that it works. Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't work. When it comes to Shabbos, everyone agrees that it's not going to work. Mistama. That's at least how I understand it. Maybe you could argue that according to Rish Lakish it works, because maybe only according to Rabbi Yehuda Reb Chanina it doesn't work, but it's definitely not clear. Okay. Now, we talked about also when it comes to a Tsuras hapesach, what if the side doesn't reach the top of the Tsuras hapesach? So Rav Nachman says it's nonetheless kosher. Rav Sheshes says that it's not kosher. There's then an interesting story with Rav Sheshes where Rav Nachman built a Tsuras hapesach for the Reish Galusa where it didn't reach the top, and Rav Sheshes had his attendant destroy it, which his attendant then went to jail. Rav Sheshes said, hey, get out of jail, and he just left jail, and that was that. Very interesting. Anyways, then Rav Sheshes saw, who was it, Rabbi Bar Shmuel, and he said, teach me something about Tsuras hapesach, and he taught him essentially regarding Mezuzah, which we then applied to Tsuras hapesach. And we said that when it comes to Mezuzah, you need to have 4 tefachim of width and 10 tefachim of height. That's the name of the game. If you don't have a total of 10 tefachim of height bichlal in the door, or you don't have 4 tefachim of width for a height of 3 tefachim, well then there's nothing to talk about. It's not going to be chayiv mezuzah. There's machlokes in Reb Meir and the Chachamim when it comes to a doorway that has 3 tefachim of height at 4 tefachim of width, and it has a total of 10 tefachim height. However, the doorway begins to arch already after 3 tefachim. So Reb Meir says that it's chayiv mezuzah because you can, kilu, imagine as if you take a knife and etch away up until the top post. and so you have a Tsuras hapesach. And the Chacham say that you don't do that, and therefore it's not chayiv mezuzah. However, everyone agrees that if there's 10 amis, if there's 10 tefachim of height with a 4 tefachim of width before it begins to arch, well then you're going to be chayiv in a mezuzah. So if we apply that to Tsuras hapesach, it would prove that the sides do not actually need to touch the height. Then at the end we got to a new Mishnah with the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel about does a mavui need both a lechi and a korah, or is a lechi or a korah alone enough? Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is that you need a lechi and you need 2 lechis. Anyways, friends, that was Daf Yud Aleph. Hope you enjoyed that very, very much, and I hope you have a great day. Peace.